The palace was silent, but not in the way one expects. It wasn't the calm of dawn over manicured gardens, nor the hush of candlelight in ornate halls. This silence was sharp, almost metallic, an absence that pressed against the chest, making the heart beat louder than any footsteps. Inside the private royal medical wing, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and old parchment, a strange mix of duty and fragility. And then came the words that fractured everything. A doctor, voice low, almost trembling, confirmed what no parent wants to hear. Princess Charlotte's wrist was broken. Prince William stood frozen, the weight of centuries pressing on his shoulders. Fury rose, raw and instinctive, but so did restraint. A duty drilled into him by birth, by history, by the crown itself. Every instinct demanded action. Every law, every protocol demanded patience. Around him, whispers began to ripple through the palace corridors, careful, measured, yet carrying the unmistakable scent of fear and suspicion. This was more than an injury. It was a fracture in the foundation of trust, in the quiet order of a world built on rules no one dares break. And now, with a sealed medical report resting in his hands, the Prince of Wales faced the first of many impossible decisions. The courtyard was silent now, but the echo of that command still hung in the air. Inside the private royal medical wing, light fell through high windows, casting long, pale rectangles across polished marble floors. The antiseptic scent lingered in the corners, mingling with the faint perfume of flowers that had been arranged hours before, now irrelevant. The moment was fragile, suspended between fact and fury. Prince William stood at the edge of the examination room, his eyes fixed on the sterile table where his daughter, Princess Charlotte, lay quietly, her small hand wrapped in a white gauze splint. The doctor's voice had barely carried beyond the threshold before it lodged itself in William's mind, relentless and unforgiving. The fractures are clear. She will need immobilization for at least 6 weeks, and the risk of complications is significant if movement continues unchecked. Those words, precise and unembellished, cut deeper than any sword. William felt the pulse of centuries in his veins. The duty of a prince, the expectation of father, an impossible collision between them. His fingers tightened around the edge of the polished counter. Anger rose, raw and volcanic, threatening to betray the restraint demanded by his office. Yet, he knew the crown required more than impulse. It required control. Outside the medical wing, the palace corridors were awakening in quiet, careful motion. Footsteps, hushed and cautious, echoed off stone walls, the subtle shuffle of servants, aides, and courtiers moving to the halls with practiced discretion. Whispers began to ripple, a low undertone of tension. How did this happen? Who was responsible? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, yet carrying the weight of potential disaster. The doctor, a calm and meticulous presence, handed William a sealed report, marked for the Prince of Wales only. The paper was heavy, not with ink, but with consequence. Every word contained the authority of truth and the burden of decision. William's eyes traced a careful script, noting the precise details of the injury, the location of each fracture, the swelling that had already begun, the faint bruising along the delicate bone. Each line was a reminder that Charlotte was fragile, human, yet destined to bear the scrutiny of the world in ways no ordinary child would. For a moment, he allowed himself a private, silent rage. The image of Charlotte in sudden pain, her small hand trembling, forced an almost unbearable tension between his instinct to act and the rigid codes of protocol that governed the palace. His mind raced through every possibility, every consequence, every misstep. Any action taken too hastily could destabilize centuries of tradition, and yet inaction felt equally perilous. The injury was no ordinary accident. It was a fracture that cut through the very notion of protection, leaving exposed the vulnerabilities that even the crown could not shield entirely. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed in a tense blur. The doctor spoke again, softer this time, almost deferentially. She will need complete immobilization. And his voice faltered briefly. We must ensure no further strain occurs. The implications, legally, politically, cannot be underestimated. William's mind, normally trained to weigh protocol with mechanical precision, faltered under the emotional weight. This was not merely a medical crisis. It was a test of judgment, a collision of paternal instinct and constitutional duty. Every corner of the palace seemed to close in on him. He could hear the subtle creak of the floors outside the room, the whisper of silk gowns along marble, the faint shuffle of leather shoes that carried intelligence, gossip, and fear. Each sound reminded him of his responsibility, and of the invisible eyes waiting for him to falter. The memory of the day's moments began to replay in his mind, fragmented and relentless. Charlotte, laughing hours before, untroubled and bright, holding a small toy that now lay forgotten. The careless stumble, the sudden cry, the immediate rush to the medical wing, the sterile corridor, the long echoing steps of attendants. And finally, the doctor's solemn declaration, hanging in the air like a gavel-striking stone. William's reflection moved to the question of cause. Nothing could be taken at face value here. Protocol demanded investigation. Who had been responsible for her safety in that moment? Which aide, which guardian, which staff member had failed? And could failure ever be accidental within the meticulously controlled confines of the palace? The implications were unbearable. The sealed report in his hand contained not just medical details, but the first legal acknowledgement of the event. Within its pages lay a coded trail, names, timings, procedural notes that could implicate anyone or shield anyone, depending on interpretation. The crown had always been protected by layers of secrecy and regulation. Now those same protections threatened to suffocate justice and clarity. Hours seemed to pass unnoticed. William remained by Charlotte's side, silently calculating, silently judging. Every instinct screamed to confront, to demand answers, to tear through the layers of obedience and formality. Yet another part of him, tempered by duty, reminded him that the weight of history demanded restraint. The palace itself seemed to recognize his turmoil, the towering walls echoing faintly with the sound of silence, almost complicit in the emotional tension that filled the room. And then, as he finally lifted his gaze from the report, a whisper carried through the corridors, soft but sharp. The prince has a report. What will he do? It was not merely curiosity. It was anticipation, calculation. Every member of the household knew that the injury of a royal child was not a private affair. It was a matter that rippled outward, touching politics, law, and legacy. What William decided in the coming hours would set a precedent far beyond the immediate crisis. He breathed slowly, grounding himself. Anger, worry, and paternal instinct coexisted with the long-learned discipline of a prince. Every microsecond held potential for disaster or order. Every decision, even one hidden from public view, carried consequence. This was a fracture that shook the crown, not just Charlotte's wrist, but the very equilibrium of duty and instinct, tradition and morality. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. The aide, careful and measured, entered with a quiet nod. The room seemed to contract around him, as if the walls themselves waited for his next move. No one spoke. Words were unnecessary. The gravity of the moment was understood without utterance. The Prince of Wales, holding the sealed report, finally exhaled. The weight of responsibility pressed against him, relentless, immutable, and absolute. One wrong move could unravel order. One hesitation could betray trust. One choice could define the legacy of his stewardship, not only as a father, but as a future king. Outside, the palace corridors remained still, yet tension had begun to thread through every corner, every doorway, every silent observer. Whispers would grow. Observers would speculate. And somewhere in the network of loyalty and duty, someone responsible for fracture, intentional or not, would be aware that the prince now held the power to demand reckoning. William's eyes drifted to Charlotte, asleep now under careful observation, unaware of the storm she had ignited. The protective instinct surged again, but it was tempered with the knowledge that protocol, law, and history would dictate the first move. There would be no impulsive action, no immediate confrontation. Yet the silence was charged with potential. For the first time that day, the prince understood the full breadth of what the injury represented. Not just pain, not just fear, but the collision of human vulnerability and institutional responsibility. And with that understanding came a certainty. Everything in the palace, every secret, every loyalty, every shadow of duty would be tested in the coming hours. The sealed medical report, resting in his hands, was no longer just paper. It was a key, a mirror, and a challenge. It demanded a decision that would ripple far beyond the white-walled corridors of the medical wing. And in the quiet, between the echoing footsteps and the faint hum of palace life, William realized the fracture went deeper than bones. It had reached the heart of the crown itself. A sealed report had been delivered. Within its pages lay the first truths and the first questions. Truths that could not be ignored, and questions that demanded answers. What he discovered next would begin to unravel the carefully constructed order of the palace, and reveal just how fragile the line between duty and action truly was. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the palace library, casting muted gold across the spines of centuries-old volumes. Outside, the gardens were calm, almost indifferent, as if unaware of the turmoil building within. Prince William sat at a polished oak table, the sealed medical report before him. Its weight a physical reminder of the fracture that had shaken both body and tradition. Silence, deliberate and suffocating, surrounded him. This was no ordinary matter of family concern. Every gesture, every word, every decision carried consequences far beyond the confines of parental care. Royal protocol was a web of invisible threads, meticulously designed to protect both crown and institution. To move too quickly risked scandal. To hesitate too long risked neglect. William's mind mapped a labyrinth of formalities, from private secretaries to constitutional advisors, each layer demanding its own ritual of consultation, notation, and sign-off. The first visitor arrived, a senior private secretary, composed, precise, and aware that any misstep could invite disaster. Papers were exchanged, handwritten notes, official memoranda, internal incident logs. "Your Highness," the secretary said softly, "all procedures have been initiated according to heritage statutes, but the record is incomplete. Some names are unverified, and a few protocols remain unconfirmed." William nodded, scanning the documents with a practiced eye. Each line was more than text. It was a measure of control, a reflection of authority exercised or deferred. Yet as he read, small inconsistencies began to emerge. Timings didn't align. Statements overlapped in ways that suggested obfuscation. Certain entries bore initials in unfamiliar handwriting. The more he probed, the more it seemed that someone was deliberately shielding the truth. Legal advisors joined in, their presence heavy with quiet authority. The room was filled with a low hum of deliberation, punctuated by the scratch of pens on paper, the shuffle of folders, the faint coughs of men and women trained to respect formality above instinct. Constitutional statutes were cited, paragraphs recited with precise enunciation, each emphasizing the limitations of royal prerogative. William listened, absorbing the careful balance between influence and compliance. Every phrase reinforced the paradox he faced. As a father, he wanted immediate answers. As a prince, he was bound by the architecture of law. Minutes turned into hours. Briefings were delivered in meticulous, emotionless tones. The palace medical team provided their clinical assessment, noting potential complications if the injury was mishandled. Security officers presented a log of staff rotations, highlighting who had been present at the time of the incident and under which protocols they were expected to act. Each disclosure brought clarity, yet also tension, like pieces of a puzzle that almost, but never fully, aligned. And then the irregularities surfaced. A single name appeared in the internal incident log where it should not have. A junior aide, listed as present and yet assigned elsewhere in prior reports. The breach, subtle yet unmistakable, sent a ripple through William's mind. A single line of text had shattered the illusion of control. Questions multiplied instantly. Was it clerical error or deliberate manipulation? If someone was willing to falsify a record, what else might be hidden? The aides and secretaries maintained calm facades, but their eyes betrayed flickers of unease. Whispers, carefully restrained, began to thread through the room. Protocol dictated silence, adherence, the appearance of order. Yet beneath that surface, the palace was moving in quiet, anxious currents. Every participant understood the stakes. The injury of a royal child was no longer a medical event. It was a challenge to the mechanisms of governance itself. William's thoughts returned to Charlotte, asleep under the watch of the medical team. The tension between paternal instinct and procedural restraint deepened. Every official meeting, every document, every log entry now carried dual weight: the protection of a child and the safeguarding of an institution. He was navigating not merely bureaucracy, but the complex architecture of loyalty, discretion, and secrecy that had grown over centuries. As the day progressed, he convened a private session with senior legal counsel. The discussion turned to statutory obligations, how the Crown could intervene, what powers were purely advisory, what actions required authorization, and what steps could be taken without attracting public scrutiny. Each recommendation was laced with caveats, every option framed as a potential risk to reputation, to stability, to the integrity of royal tradition. Amid the deliberations, subtle inconsistencies continued to surface. Some reports referenced unnamed witnesses. Others cited instructions given but not recorded elsewhere. It became clear that someone had navigated the procedural maze to obscure facts. The realization was unnerving. The palace, designed to uphold order, had inadvertently provided cover for deception. William felt the weight of centuries pressing down, the unseen eyes of history observing his next move. In quiet moments between meetings, he revisited the medical details, cross-referencing them with personnel logs. The pattern suggested negligence, perhaps even deliberate avoidance of responsibility. Yet proving intent within constraints of palace law was a delicate endeavor. Every accusation required a trail of documented evidence. Every intervention needed justification, grounded in statute. Emotion alone could not dictate action. Hours later, he called a meeting with the chief of security, the room heavy with tension. "I need clarity," William said, voice measured but firm. "Every report, every log, every protocol. If there is deviation, I need to know why." The chief responded with calm efficiency, outlining shifts, rotations, and monitoring protocols. Yet beneath the factual presentation, a subtle tension lingered. Loyalty, obedience, and fear were woven tightly into every action. No one could be certain whether truth would emerge voluntarily or only under pressure. As evening approached, William stepped back, reviewing the documentation that had accumulated. The palace seemed larger, more labyrinthine than ever, every corridor echoing with unspoken rules. The risk of scandal was real, but the risk of inaction, of failing Charlotte, was far greater. Protocol and duty were no longer abstract principles. They were shields, but also chains. Finally, he paused on the anomalous entry in the incident log. The unauthorized name could not be ignored. It suggested that someone, somewhere, had chosen silence over truth. William recognized the first concrete breach of protocol, and with it, the first tangible lead in uncovering what had really occurred. The danger was no longer hypothetical. It was present, concealed behind a veneer of orderly paperwork. The hours passed in measured, suffocating rhythm. Each consultation, each briefing, reinforced a single truth. The palace could hide many things, but not everything. The fracture extended beyond Charlotte's wrist. It had infiltrated the mechanisms designed to protect her. And William, caught between duty and instinct, understood that navigating the web of protocol would demand patience, precision, and relentless scrutiny. As night fell, the library's candles flickered, casting long shadows across ledgers and reports. The sense of inevitability grew. The quiet corridors were no longer indifferent. They were loaded with anticipation. Somewhere within the palace, those who had manipulated records, those who had obstructed clarity, would soon realize that Prince William was methodical, observant, and uncompromising. The unauthorized entry in internal log remained a singular beacon, illuminating the path forward. Every official account, every meticulously maintained record, would be examined against it. The prince's strategy was forming, not in anger, but in a measured cadence of procedure. Evidence would guide action. Protocol would dictate timing. Justice, quiet, controlled, and without spectacle, would proceed according to principle, not impulse. And yet, beneath the methodical exterior, a personal tension simmered. The emotional toll of Charlotte's injury, the fear invoked, and the realization that someone within their trusted circle might have contributed to it, weighed on him with constant gravity. Each breath, each step, each glance across the documents reminded him that protection, truth, and duty were inseparable, and the failure of one imperiled all. Hours later, a final brief arrived, a cross-reference of medical staff, aides, and protocol officers. Every name, every schedule, every procedural note was included, but the anomaly persisted. One line, unchanged, hinted at deliberate concealment. William's eyes lingered on it. A single deviation, subtle and easily overlooked by many, yet glaringly obvious to him. He leaned back in the high-back chair, allowing the weight of the day to settle. Every consultation, every note, every whisper had been accounted for, yet the silence remained dangerous. It was a silence that concealed motives, intentions, and perhaps even betrayal. Within the palace, appearances were maintained, but beneath them, uncertainty festered. The prince rose, collecting the folders and reports, carefully sealing them for review. The investigation was far from over. The fracture in protocol, now identified, was a thread that, if followed, could unravel complacency, reveal negligence, and demand accountability. Yet even as he prepared for the next stage, William understood that the palace itself would resist exposure. Tradition, loyalty, and fear were formidable adversaries. He paused at the door, gazing briefly at the sleeping figure Charlotte. Protection, truth, and protocol were intertwined in ways that demanded both caution and resolve. The road ahead would be long, meticulous, and fraught with tension. One misstep could compromise not just justice, but trust, stability, and the very integrity of the crown. And then, among the stacks of procedural logs and heritage statutes, an unauthorized name appeared. A breach so subtle it might have gone unnoticed. That single line would ignite the next confrontation, forcing choices that challenged loyalty, tested authority, and revealed just how dangerous silence could be within the walls of the palace. The palace corridors felt unusually narrow that morning, each echo of William's footsteps magnified by the weight of anticipation. The name he had discovered, an unauthorized presence in the incident log, was no longer a mere clerical anomaly. It was proof that someone had deliberately bypassed protocol, hiding actions that now demanded confrontation. The question no longer lingered: who had failed Charlotte's protection? The question had become unavoidable: who would be held accountable? William entered a council chamber, a room dominated by centuries of portraits, every painted gaze seemingly observing him, weighing his next move. The senior officials and heads of security had assembled, their posture rigid, expressions carefully neutral. They were trained to maintain composure, to answer without revealing fear. Yet William felt the tension radiate in measured pulses from each one. This was a gathering, not a collaboration, but of reckoning. "I have reviewed every report," William began, voice steady yet charged. "I have cross-referenced personnel logs, medical notes, and internal protocols. There is one clear anomaly, a name appearing where it should not. I demand an explanation. And if accountability cannot be established voluntarily, I will authorize action." His words, deliberate and formal, filled the high-ceilinged chamber, reverberating like the toll of a bell. The room fell silent. No one immediately responded. Eyes darted toward one another, searching for guidance, for a safe harbor in the storm of authority that had just landed upon them. The chief of security shifted slightly, offering the first controlled response. "Your Highness, the entry may reflect a procedural oversight. Our initial review does not suggest intent, only miscommunication within staff rotations." William's gaze sharpened, unwavering. "An oversight?" His voice carried the precision of someone trained to cut through pretense. "An oversight that concerns the safety of my daughter? That concerns the integrity of the crown? Oversight in this matter is negligence, and negligence has consequences." A low murmur swept through the assembled officials, restrained but palpable. Loyalty to the crown was universal. Loyalty to individuals within the palace hierarchy, however, was layered with fear, ambition, and caution. The room contained the perfect tension between duty and self-preservation. William recognized it immediately, reading each subtle shift, each micro-expression of hesitation, of calculation. "The situation is not abstract," he continued. "It is not a matter of paperwork or procedural niceties. My daughter was injured. Someone failed in their responsibility. That failure must be addressed, and it must be addressed now." The mid-morning light fell through tall windows, casting bars of illumination across the chamber. Each face was partially revealed, partially shadowed, symbolic of the transparency William demanded and the secrecy others hoped to maintain. The prince's authority was clear yet constrained. He could demand answers, but he could not dictate every legal consequence without proper channels. Still, the demand itself, public within these walls, private in documentation, was unprecedented. A senior advisor spoke, measured but firm. "Your Highness, with all due respect, any immediate directive for arrest or sanction could breach established law enforcement protocols. We must proceed carefully or risk constitutional overreach." William's expression hardened. Careful? For weeks, Charlotte's welfare has been subject to the same careful procedures, and the result is a fractured wrist. Do you still consider caution sufficient? The chamber fell into suffocating silence. No one dared meet his eyes directly. Words were carefully chosen, each phrase a balance between truth and self-preservation. The tension was not theatrical. It was real, thick in the air, each heartbeat audible in its absence. Loyalty to the crown collided with personal loyalty, and every official understood that their response, or lack thereof, would carry consequences far beyond this room. Minutes passed, then a subtle shift. The chief of security cleared his throat. "There were warnings," he said quietly, almost reluctantly. Warnings that were ignored. Protocols flagged potential risks, but they were deemed non-critical. We acted on assessment, not assumption. William's mind tightened around the revelation. The injury, he realized, was not a spontaneous accident. It was a culmination of ignored warnings, of deliberate negligence disguised as routine procedure. The moral weight deepened. This was no longer about oversight. It was about choice. Someone had chosen inaction. Someone had chosen to prioritize convenience or reputation over duty. The revelation expanded like a shadow across the room. Whispers, restrained but insistent, began threading along the walls. Officials exchanged subtle glances, aware that loyalty, legality, and fear now intersected in a dangerous confluence. Every participant sensed the stakes. The prince's next words could ignite action that had been carefully avoided for decades. William's voice, measured yet piercing, cut through the tension. If negligence is established, action will be taken. Let it be clear. Loyalty does not exempt responsibility. Protocol does not absolve failure. And the safety of the crown's heirs is non-negotiable. The chief of security nodded slowly, acknowledging the authority, yet constrained by centuries of procedural hierarchy. The chamber's atmosphere shifted. The inevitability of consequences was palpable, yet within the silence, fear simmered. Who would be sacrificed to uphold principle? And who would bear the weight of exposure? Minutes turned into hours, each second punctuated by the rustle of paper, the tap of pens, and the quiet deliberation of minds trained to navigate both law and legacy. William reviewed timelines, personnel assignments, and warnings. Each detail, each note, added to a pattern increasingly impossible to dismiss. The injury was preventable. Negligence had created opportunity. An opportunity, left unchecked, had led to harm. A junior officer, previously unnoticed, approached with hesitant steps. "Your Highness," he murmured, "there may be additional information regarding prior warnings." Some of it was escalated internally, but not formally documented. William's gaze, sharp and unwavering, fixed on him. "Bring it forward," he commanded. "Now." As reports were assembled, a picture emerged. Charlotte's injury was not isolated. Multiple indicators had been ignored. Staff had failed to act, not through ignorance, but through an action sanctioned by cautious oversight. The moral calculus became unbearable. This was not an accident. This was a choice, a decision, deliberate or negligent, that demanded consequence. Hours later, William convened the senior officials once more. The room, now thick with tension, awaited his verdict. The demand, the moral imperative, was clear. Accountability would not be postponed. Arrests, sanctions, or formal reprimands would proceed, guided by principle and supported by documented evidence. The silence of centuries, the invisible walls of protocol, could no longer shield those who had failed. He paused, allowing the weight of history and responsibility to settle over the chamber. Every participant understood the gravity. Centuries of tradition could bend, but they could not break the authority vested in protection of the crown. Loyalty, duty, and morality intersected in a way that demanded clarity. Failure could not be tolerated. And then, as William's mind replayed the morning's revelations, a single phrase returned, spoken quietly by the attending doctor during Charlotte's initial examination. We must ensure no further strain occurs. The implications, legally, politically, cannot be underestimated. That sentence, almost mundane at the time, now carried the force of inevitability. It was no longer simply advice, it was a warning, a truth that demanded action. The decision crystallized within him. Accountability could not wait. Delay would compound negligence. The injury had already fractured more than bones. It had fractured trust, duty, an invisible line between private care and public responsibility. The path forward was clear, yet impossible. Uphold law, protect family, and confront betrayal, all within the suffocating constraints of palace protocol. As night fell, the chamber emptied, leaving William alone with the assembled evidence. The palace corridors outside were quiet, almost reverent. Shadows stretched long across marble floors, echoing the weight of decisions yet to be executed. One truth lingered, heavy and unyielding. The fracture had moved beyond Charlotte, beyond staff, beyond protocol. It had entered the very heart of loyalty, demanding action that no one could ignore. Every official had been warned, every anomaly documented. The next stage would test authority, challenge tradition, and confront the delicate balance between duty and justice. In the stillness, William understood that the demand he had made would not be popular, and it would not be simple, but it was necessary. The prince's next move would cross lines that had never before been crossed within the palace walls. The very notion of accountability would be redefined. Loyalty would be questioned. Silence would no longer be tolerated. And in that charged quiet, one truth became undeniable. The fracture could no longer be hidden. Injustice, however measured, would follow. A single sentence from the doctor replayed relentlessly in William's mind, a quiet warning now turned imperative. The choice before him was irreversible: demand arrests or allow negligence to remain unchallenged. One decision would redefine loyalty within the palace, and nothing would ever be the same. The palace felt colder that morning, though the sun had risen high over the manicured gardens. Marble halls stretched in perfect symmetry, but within their shadowed recesses, a different truth lingered. Papers lay stacked in careful order, yet beneath their neat appearance rested secrets the palace had long hoped would remain buried. Prince William moved through the corridors with measured steps, every echo a reminder that history had its eyes upon him. The fracture of Charlotte's wrist had opened more than flesh and bone. It had exposed cracks in trust, discipline, and loyalty. Hidden within the private archives, he began the slow process of uncovering what had been quietly stored away. Incident reports marked confidential, memos documenting past warnings ignored, complaints that had vanished into the shadowed bureaucracy. The handwriting varied, signatures faded, yet a pattern became undeniable. Each piece of paper was a silent witness, chronicling a series of oversights and failures, deliberate or otherwise. The palace, designed to preserve order, had become complicit in concealment. William's fingers traced the margins of a particularly old memo, yellowed and brittle. It spoke of prior incidents, minor in isolation, but together forming a mosaic of negligence. Names that should have been held accountable had been reassigned, praised, or left unchallenged. Every file, every annotation, reinforced the same uncomfortable truth. In the name of loyalty, silence had been chosen over transparency. The weight of this realization pressed on him. Trust, he understood, was currency within the palace, fragile and meticulously maintained. Yet even the strongest bonds had shown vulnerability. Courtiers he had once relied upon, protectors he had assumed unwavering, were now shadows of reliability. Their loyalty was conditional, tempered by convenience, fear, or self-interest. The fracture in protocol that had injured Charlotte was not an isolated error. It was the culmination of decades of deferred accountability. He paused before a cabinet containing private correspondence, carefully selecting letters that had never been formally filed. Some were complaints from staff, meticulously ignored. Others were internal notes, marked confidential, detailing minor injuries or potential risks that had been dismissed as trivial. Patterns emerged. A culture of avoidance, of polite silence, where action was deferred to protect reputation rather than prevent harm. William's jaw tightened. The moral clarity of principle had been consistently sacrificed to the convenience of secrecy. Later, in a private meeting with the chief of security, William confronted the broader implications. "This is not about a single mistake," he said. "It is about a system that prioritizes image over safety." Each failure, no matter how minor it seemed at the time, contributed to Charlotte's injury. The chief's response was measured, but the hesitation was palpable. He acknowledged lapses, procedural oversights, and missed opportunities, yet every word was carefully hedged, constrained by the weight of hierarchy and tradition. The prince moved to the council chamber, documents in hand, confronting senior advisors with slow-burning intensity. Each revelation, each suppressed record, demanded acknowledgement. The palace had tried to maintain order through concealment, but the truth was now unavoidable. The emotional tension was not theatrical, it was palpable. Silence, once protective, now betrayed them. Every courtier understood that the veneer of stability had cracked, and that trust, once fractured, demanded deliberate repair. Hours passed as William meticulously cross-referenced reports, identifying inconsistencies, confirming omissions, and highlighting deliberate concealments. The palace, vast and imposing, had attempted to bury truth beneath layers of protocol, but every hidden file, every forgotten warning, now became evidence. The quiet despair of those complicit in omission was visible in fleeting glances, restrained gestures, and the tight lines around eyes trained for formality. The emotional toll was evident. William's sense of duty was weighed against the betrayal he now confronted. Every action, every decision, was a balance between principle and consequence. The truth could not be rewritten, nor could accountability be indefinitely postponed. The palace had protected itself for centuries through silence, but that protection had created vulnerability, leaving the crown exposed to failures it could no longer ignore. Evening fell, casting long shadows through the corridors. William reviewed a final set of files, internal logs, private warnings, and incident records, all pointing to the same conclusion. Negligence had not been accidental, and silence had compounded harm. The realization was cold and relentless. The palace had preserved its image at the expense of principle, and in doing so, had endangered the very trust upon which it depended. He reflected on the emotional weight of these discoveries. The injury of a child was more than a medical incident. It was a test of institutional integrity. The fractures of protocol mirrored the fractures of trust. Every suppressed truth, every archive complaint, had contributed to the moment that Charlotte had been hurt. And William, as both father and future monarch, understood that restoring order required confronting these hidden truths directly. The night deepened, and the palace seemed to breathe with quiet tension. Candles flickered along marble walls, casting shadows that dance over centuries of history. William closed the archives, documents carefully organized yet fully acknowledged. The weight of knowledge was heavy, yet necessary. Silence had been broken, and with it, the foundations of accountability were being rewritten. A formal authorization would soon be issued. Quietly, deliberately, and irrevocably, the palace could no longer hide behind procedure or discretion. The next stage would reveal not just failure, but the cost of silence, and the crown would confront the truths it had long sought to bury. The palace awoke with quiet efficiency that morning. Yet beneath the calm exterior, tension coiled like a hidden serpent. Courtiers, aides, and security personnel moved with careful precision, each aware that a storm had already passed through the corridors and another was imminent. Prince William, carrying the weight of both fatherhood and authority, prepared for a moment that would be recorded not in public ceremonies or accolades, but in the silent ledger of justice. The individual responsible for Charlotte's injury had been identified through painstaking review of protocols, logs, and prior warnings. This was no ordinary reprimand. It was a reckoning designed not to entertain, but to restore principle. William understood that within the palace, justice was never celebrated. It was subtle, methodical, and deliberate. Silent in its execution, resolute in its consequence. The arrest was carried out within the palace walls, under the watch of security officers whose faces were unreadable. There were no flashing lights, no announcements, no crowd to witness the moment, only the careful coordination of procedure. Every step documented and verified, ensured that order was maintained. The individual, once shielded by bureaucratic ambiguity, was led away with dignity intact, but freedom curtailed, the consequences of negligence made unavoidably real. William observed from a distance, his expression composed but internally taut. This was not vengeance. It was adherence to principle, an affirmation that the crown protected not merely by decree, but by action grounded in accountability. Every motion, every protocol followed, underscored the moral weight of the decision, that the welfare of a child and the integrity of the institution were inseparable, even when no applause followed. The courtiers, who had long relied on silent compliance to navigate the intricacies of palace life, recognized the clarity of purpose. Orders had been executed, responsibility assigned, and the ripple of consequences was palpable. There was no spectacle, no fanfare, but a quiet understanding that accountability had arrived, and with it, the restoration of trust within the palace hierarchy. Even in the absence of triumph, there was resolution. Charlotte's injury would heal, but the palace itself had been forever altered by the lessons of this ordeal. The careful architecture of protocol had been tested, exposing both vulnerability and resilience. William, aware of the delicate balance he maintained between duty and family, recognized that leadership required action tempered by principle, not applause. The weight of his choices remained with him long after the immediate steps had been completed. He reflected on the gravity of authority exercised without recognition, the silent affirmation that justice within the monarchy is measured in adherence to principle, not public acclaim. The palace corridors, now returning to routine, still carried the quiet echoes of the lessons learned, the tension softened but not forgotten. The day concluded with an unspoken acknowledgement among those who had participated. The crown had acted, the failure had been addressed, and the principle of protection had prevailed. Yet in the stillness, William understood that such victories were seldom visible to the world outside these walls. True restoration came in the quiet assurance that duty had been fulfilled and that silence would no longer shield negligence. The palace returned to routine, yet something fundamental had changed. The fracture had been addressed, but the lessons it carried would shape the choices, loyalty, and vigilance of everyone within the walls for years to come. The crown had confronted failure, and in doing so, had quietly rewritten the rules of accountability. The palace was quieter now, as if the very walls had absorbed the lessons of the past weeks. Marble corridors that once echoed with careful protocol now held a subtle weight, a reminder of the fractures that had shaken the institution. Prince William walked slowly, each step deliberate, his thoughts distant yet precise. The events surrounding Charlotte's injury had passed from crisis to resolution, but the implications lingered heavy as carved stone. Charlotte herself was recovering. Her small hand now supported an brace that allowed gentle movement, but shielded fragile bones from further harm. She smiled with the resilience of youth, unaware of the complex orchestration that had protected her, guided by both instinct and rule. For William, the relief was profound but tinged with awareness. Protection of a child within the crown required choices far more complex than any ordinary parent might imagine. Every decision carried consequence. Every delay risked harm, and every action was a negotiation between morality and protocol. He spent long hours reflecting on what had transpired. The palace's machinery of duty and silence had been exposed, revealing the cracks where negligence had flourished. Yet through the deliberate exercise of authority, through adherence to principle rather than impulse, the crown had chosen its highest responsibility, the protection of life over image, of duty over comfort, of moral clarity over public recognition. This was justice without applause, action measuring quiet effectiveness rather than spectacle. In the solitude of study, William examined the sealed reports, the internal logs, and the formal authorizations that had quietly corrected the failures. Each document was a reminder that the monarchy's strength lay not in its ability to hide truth, but in its capacity to act decisively when necessary. The realization was slow, solemn, and deeply human. Power is meaningless unless guided by moral responsibility. And in this instance, the crown had chosen the child. The palace courtiers, once anxious and restrained, now moved with a subtle confidence tempered by the knowledge that accountability had been restored. Trust, though shaken, was renewed. not by fear or spectacle, but through the quiet reinforcement of principle. Loyalty had been tested and, in many cases, reaffirmed. The machinery of governance, once misused or neglected, had been realigned with its intended purpose: protection, vigilance, and unwavering responsibility. Evening descended slowly. Light from the tall windows fell across the floors in long, fading patterns, casting the palace in muted tones of reflection. William paused in the corridors, listening to the faint hum of routine. Footsteps, hushed voices, the shuffle of papers and quiet conversations. The palace had returned to normalcy in appearance, but beneath the surface, a permanent transformation had taken place. The lessons of negligence, of silence, and of duty's uncompromising weight would not be forgotten. He thought of Charlotte again, of her small hand now capable of gentle play, of the laughter that filled the rooms once more. And he understood that this recovery was symbolic as well as physical. The crown had healed, too, not through avoidance or concealment, but through deliberate, principled action. The fracture, though initially devastating, had revealed the true priorities of monarchy: protection above protocol, duty above image, the child above all else. As night settled, the palace seemed to exhale, a subtle release of tension and consequence. The corridors, the chambers, and the high-ceiling halls carried an air of quiet reverence, the kind born from endurance and reflection rather than celebration. William walked slowly through these spaces, aware that every decision made in this period would shape future governance, influence loyalty, and define the moral compass of those within the walls. He paused before Charlotte's room, listening to her gentle breathing. In that quiet, he allowed himself a rare moment of stillness, free from protocol, reports, and obligations. The child slept peacefully, protected, and the knowledge of that protection was a solemn reassurance. For William, it was proof that the crown at its best could reconcile the often opposing forces of power, tradition, and humanity. The experience had etched itself deeply into his understanding of leadership. Authority without compassion is brittle. Duty without moral clarity is hollow. The palace, with its centuries of tradition and its intricate hierarchy, had been reminded of the simplest truth: the safety and welfare of the child must always outweigh the convenience of procedure, the preservation of image, or the comfort of silence. And yet, even in this quiet reflection, the memory of tension lingered. The palace would always hold shadows, moments where negligence could grow, and where loyalty might falter. William understood that vigilance was a continuous exercise, a responsibility renewed with every day, every decision, every life entrusted to crown. Ending transition. The child had been protected. The institution had been corrected. And yet, in the shadows of the palace, questions remained, truths that had yet to be revealed, secrets still concealed behind protocol and tradition. What other hidden fractures awaited discovery within the walls of the monarchy?